So against this background, and looking forward from now, what can we expect of policy and developmental priorities in China? There will be a re-emphasis on China's domestic priorities. Some 200 million people have been made comparatively affluent by virtue of China's reforms. This means that there are still 1.1 billion people waiting for their chance at affluence. As Hu Jintao's statement shows, there is already an increased emphasis on social justice and a shift towards quality versus quantity in economic development. This implies permanently lower growth rates. The small contribution of net exports becomes even smaller, but growth occurs off a larger base. Remember, it's now a $5 trillion economy. Industrial restructuring, consolidation, optimization, higher value added, more attention and implementation on environmental performance, energy efficiency, etc. And perhaps, paradoxically, in many people's minds, there will be continued market reforms, i.e. the use of the price mechanism, competitive supply-demand pressures, and restraints at the outbound customs barrier in order to achieve policy objectives. The use of China's capital and forex stockpiles will support infrastructural expansion and industrial optimization, will support R&D, the acquisition of technologies, and will support and facilitate the secure supply of energy and raw materials. Now, obviously, in line with the social justice agenda and in the interests of social and political stability, we should expect an acceleration of policy-driven initiatives in the development of social welfare, pension schemes, healthcare, rural development, etc. We should not expect any real central-level policy support for further industrial capacity expansion. We should not expect China to encourage investment in energy-intensive or polluting industries or low-value-added export industries. As in many countries around the world, China's policymakers will wrestle with a tension between openness and protectionism, but domestic priorities will triumph. So the imperatives that drive China's developmental model have shifted as a function of successful policy outcomes. Policy is changing, has been changing, to adjust to new circumstances. Much of China's policy making is deliberate and very intentional, but some of it has had to be more ad hoc in response in responding to short-term imperatives. The current leadership of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao came to power nearly 8 years ago, and they have a slightly different view of the world to their predecessors, and it's apparent that they are both generationally disposed to a slightly more humanist and social justice development agenda. In my view, that's what they mean when they say harmonious society. They are responding to very different challenges to their predecessors. The legacy they inherited gave them a self-sustaining economic growth model and the financial resources to move policy in new directions, but they also inherited the unforeseen and unintended negatives embedded in that growth model. And until quite recently, they found it quite difficult to get much traction in pushing changes to the model. Nobody listens to a government in an economic boom. So paradoxically, the global financial crisis, the recession that the world has lived through and the export slowdown, and the impact of this on the Chinese economy over the last 12 to 15 months, while requiring a good bit of ad hoc policy making, may also well precipitate the acceleration of policy implementation in the direction of the quality over quantity developmental model. I described it in an interview a few months ago as the crisis from central casting. It's exactly what they needed. So what are the implications for Australia and our relationship with China? Excuse me a minute. It's not Jim. Now, while it hasn't always been smooth, and while we have recently been forced to think harder about the implications of being a supplier to China, Australia has done well out of China's economic ascent. A thoughtful man said to me recently that many in Australia have to date only seen China as a source of rapid enrichment rather than as a real long-term partner. And there is something in that statement, but it does take two to tango. Australia's China relationship of the last decade has been very beneficial and relatively undemanding for the broader commercial, political and general population. Australia has cruised along on the crest of a trade. We have moved on from the slight naivety surrounding the concept of a special relationship back in the 80s and early 90s, and we've developed a narrative around the idea of complementary economies. We have applauded the Chinese government's role in delivering rising affluence to millions, and politically Australia's played a broker's role in engaging China. The six-party talks on the Korean Peninsula had an Australian hand in their nurture. We got the Chinese to participate in a UN peacekeeping role for the first time in East Timor. We worked hard to bring the Chinese into APEC. And Australia's been something of a go-between and supporter of Chinese aspirations in other areas. So this was, for the most part, I think, a blend of commendable realpolitik and a genuine interest in integrating the new regional power. China's less attractive traits were also still critiqued in Australia, but in a manner slightly more measured and restrained than that of our counterparts in the United States and Europe. In recent years, China was popularly rated among Australians as less of a risk to global peace and prosperity than the United States. But in recent years, things have changed, both in terms of popular perceptions and in the political and commercial reality. Australia's relationship with China has many component parts, but much as you would have all, of course, expect me to suggest that resources are quite important, I struggle to develop a view that can credibly argue that our relationship with China is truly underpinned by any more critical element. So let's talk a little bit about resources. China's growth has come upon us suddenly, and nowhere is a better example of unpreparedness and reluctance to take China seriously than the resources sector. As an industry, we really did struggle to believe that China was finally arriving as a source of sustained demand, the sustainability question yet again. We were happy to see demand improve and prices rise, but we had a hard time believing that that demand would be there again next year. The Chinese, with their unreliable statistics, a suspicion of foreign suppliers, negotiations-motivated opaque forecasting, etc., they didn't help matters much. They had their old reflexes and we had ours. We were all fighting the last war. Believe me, there's plenty of blame to go around. The resources sector was a very unsexy sector until China happened. Now, of course, resources is topic du jour. For over 20 years, the sector experienced serial real price decline and very low growth. Raw materials buyers, under pressures of their own from a low Western world growth dynamic, continued to force prices down. There was structural surplus capacity in almost every commodity. The natural outcome in such circumstances is self-evident. Companies consolidate to achieve greater economies of scale, and the industry consistently disinvests in exploration, in talent, in capacity. And all affiliated industries disinvest too. Engineering companies, equipment suppliers, tyre manufacturers, and even universities stop training mining engineers and geologists. So when the upturn came, no one really believed it had much in the way of legs, and so there was a lag of several years between the advent of real new demand and the supply-side investment in capacity to respond. And there was a further lag between that investment actually going into the ground and the actual availability of material volumes of new supply. So this is the phase we're in at the moment. And of course, in a global market, when supplies are short, prices rise. There's a lot of discussion, particularly on the part of Chinese iron ore buyers, about the extent to which supply is controlled or concentrated in the hands of a few companies. I cannot tell you how wide of the mark that kind of thinking is in terms of being truly the wrong thing to focus on. But China is new and relatively inexperienced as a participant in global markets, and also is newer and even less experienced as a participant in global resources sector M&A. It's going to take a little time for the Chinese players to work their way up the learning curve. They're very smart, they will do it, but they will make some mistakes and there will be some unfortunate misunderstandings along the way. It's a critical matter from an Australian perspective, and it's going to take a lot more time than I have here this evening to discuss it properly. Wen Xiang, a Manchu statesman, a prime minister of China in the 19th century, once said to some foreign visitors, "You are all too anxious to awake us and to start us on a new road, and you will do it. But you will all regret it, for once awaked and started, we shall go fast and far, farther than you think, much farther than you want." That says it all. So, as you've heard me say a few times already, I think the first and most important issue to deal with is how far China is going to go, i.e. the sustainability of the developmental model. That's not mine. No, it's not. I've tried to use that earlier extensive narrative of the past 30 years to demonstrate that there are very substantial foundations under China's economic development, and that China is not an artificial construct of the last 5 to 7 years or some sort of smokescreen of fabricated statistics, as is often implied. We can nitpick all we like, but China is here to stay. Our problem is increasingly not so much one of continuing to analyse or over-analyse China's sustainability as one of simply accepting China's permanence and putting our efforts into making the necessary adjustments in the way that we respond. In Australia, China's sustainability really matters. Now, while we've done a lot of good things in terms of running our own economy prudently, being able to export resources to China is a substantial component of our status as one of the few economically robust OECD economies. So therefore, if China were to slow dramatically, we have a problem. By contrast, China's economic impact on many of our developed world peer nations is much less complementary and more that of a competitor. And I think this leads to a degree of ambiguity or even schizophrenia in the discussion and commentary about Australia in China, about China and Australia. We have a propensity to observe and analyse China from the perspective of the liberal, democratic, market economy, Western world, post-World War II, Bretton Woods, Atlantic Alliance dominated US-led hegemony. It's a bit of a mouthful, I'll say it again if you need it. We have been a part of that hegemony, not a leader, but a follower, and a beneficiary of it. China is unequivocally a significant threat to that hegemony, the nature of which is exacerbated by the fact that being an ancient civilization with its own values and worldview, distinct and different from those which have been globally dominant through the 19th and 20th centuries. The nature of China's interaction with that hegemony has been characterized by the Western world's almost unrelenting criticism of China, China's imperviousness to that criticism, and the success of China's developmental model by virtue of ignoring that criticism and most of the unrequited advice that came with it. Now, the point is that the Chinese are not really beholden to the existing world order. They clearly wish to see some changes in that order, and they now have the influence to prompt those changes. We in Australia, by virtue of munificent economic geology, are in the awkward position of being a beneficiary of China's emergence, while the power and influence of our traditional allies is potentially being eroded by China's emergence. So in line with our slightly compromised status, much of the discussion in Australia echoes the discussion in political and media circles in the US and Europe. I wrote a piece last year in which I attempted to assess the ways in which the Western world currently thinks about China, and as usual I identified the hub of most discussion as being the issue of China's sustainability. From my own experience, I know that this, in many and varied forms, is almost the only topic of conversation in business circles, among investors, in the popular media, in academia, and among politicians. China's unquestionably robust and sustained economic growth and increasing presence in our world doesn't ever seem to dampen the suspicion that some kind of crash or collapse might be imminent. And this gives rise to a Janus-like anxiety. On one face, if China is sustainable and keeps going, the world order as we know it is very likely to experience fundamental change. On the other face, if China is not sustainable, we go back to the way things were. This would be a huge relief to many in the United States and Europe, but would no doubt be greeted in Australia with some ambivalence. We could live with that outcome in geopolitical, civilizational terms, but the collapse of China would be disastrous for us in economic terms. Message to Australia: our little economic wagon is inextricably hitched to China's success, which means that our interests and those of our traditional allies and trading partners are diverging. That's a delicate spot to be in, and we're going to need some real geopolitical and commercial agility in the years to come. Let me make a couple of closing observations. Now, I'm certainly not here as a defender of the obvious shortcomings of the Chinese government in terms of human rights and intellectual property and predatory mercantilist economic policy and commercial behaviour, etc., etc., etc. There's a very long list of things to critique about China, which I haven't covered tonight, because they all get so well covered elsewhere, every day, all the time. Neither do I wish to overemphasize the idea of some kind of ominous looming hegemony of China. My aim has been to talk about the simple reality of China as a massive, new, undeniable and sustainable feature of the global landscape, and the likelihood that as a result of China becoming more influential and assertive, that landscape is going to be distinctly different to what we've all been used to. There is a greater need for us in Australia to think clearly and deeply about China than is the case for many other countries. We need to be neither daunted nor in denial, and we can't be blindly opportunistic, and we can't be vulnerable to being gamed. It's undoubtedly complicated and delicate, and I don't think there are any trite, soundbite style easy answers. I would suggest that many of the currently popular constructs for observing China, the current preeminent Western world narratives, are generally wishful and simplistic. And they are also not applicable to Australia's peculiar place in the new order of things. So our first challenge, I think, is to become more comfortable with the complexity of the situation. Richard Rigby wrote a good piece on this recently. Our second challenge is to come to terms with a new normal that includes China as a dominant presence. Our third challenge is to acknowledge and analyse the distinctiveness of Australia's status in the evolving world order. And our final challenge is to develop the responses that best serve our national interest over time, rather than responses that are either subservient to the wishful narratives of our civilizational brethren or are too tempted by the siren song of mercantilist opportunism. So the changing China that I've been privileged to observe for the last 30 years is characterised by several features: scale, complexity, diversity, dynamism, opacity. The virtues of the Chinese people, a willingness to work, a reverence for literacy, a propensity to save, have been well harnessed to the cause of national development in the last 30 years by the insights of Deng Xiaoping, and have been nurtured through an unusually extended period of stability by a government that has muddled through with considerable agility, and by Chinese standards, some benevolence. The change in China has been good for the Chinese people, and has generally been good for the world, and certainly for Australia. Now, what we perhaps didn't anticipate is the extent to which the arrival of a wealthy and powerful China would be disruptive. China is with us. China's not going away anytime soon. China will continue to change, and China will inevitably become more influential and assertive of her national interests. So the onus is on us, as I said at the beginning, to be good at reading the signs and to be agile enough to make the appropriate adjustments so that our national interests are also asserted and protected. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'd first like to start by thanking Clinton for putting so much effort into his speech. I wish all speakers at the Lowy Institute would do that. Some do, but not all of them. And next week I'm speaking, so now my bar has just gone up. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and there's a microphone in the back. This is, of course, off the record, and we'll start. The microphone's already on, so.
Clinton, Kevin Hopgood-Brown from Sun O' Gold. Thank you very much for those interesting and insightful comments. We've just recommenced our free trade agreement negotiations with China after 5 years. If you're sitting in Beijing, what is there in an FTA with Australia that would incentivize China to reach an agreement with us?
Not much. You know, it's in terms of overwhelming national interest on both sides. Why are we doing it? That's why it's hard. If there's actually a compelling imperative on either side to get it done, you'll work out how to do it. But we've been struggling away for a long time, and arguing about. There's a little bit maybe in agriculture, but arguing about whether or not bloody lawyers should be allowed to work in China is, let's face it. You hate to say that any country, China does need more lawyers, but, that's why there's a problem. There's really not an overweening national interest in getting one and the other, particularly since it's easy to sign something with New Zealand or Chile because you can kind of do it on the back of someone's shirt at the airport on their way out. It's not much. But with Australia, we're actually a serious country, and we need an Encyclopaedia Britannica of nasty tautologies all the way through in order to actually believe in the FTA, and that's the hard part, particularly when the effort-reward balances just don't seem to be there. And someone like MOFCOM, who we deal with, by virtue of WTO in particular, have shot a lot of the bullets they have with the other constituencies around the polity in Beijing in terms of dragging people across the line.
Peter Burnett, Investec Bank. If I can ask probably two questions. The first is, beyond being a coal truck hitched to China's growth engine, what can Australia hope to be of relevance to China over the next 20 or 30 years? And the second question is, if we try and de-link ourselves from a Western-focused view of China, how does China view India in the emerging new world?
I mean, you have to be real. I think in the modern world, the way trade is liberalised and will continue to liberalise, globalised. The simple reality is that globally, all countries are more or less being forced back to comparative advantage. So you kind of have to look at what are you good at. Now, there's a few things that we are good at. We do have a lot of good geology, so that's an obvious one. We're a pretty nice tourist destination. That's going to be useful. We do have a modern democratic society, and there is much in the way of governance and rule of law stuff that the Chinese actually do want to learn about. Education. So there's a whole lot of things. The other thing about Australia is that, we are a Western nation, but we don't come loaded with either US ideological baggage or European proto-colonial baggage. And I think we've much underestimated that. The Chinese actually do like us. They think we're kind of cute, And I don't know if we've leveraged that to the extent that we could. So I think there's a very wide spray of things. Although China doesn't want to be like America when they grow up. They're going to be Chinese. But within that, they have a very strong interest in understanding the virtues of higher quality governance, the virtues of pluralism, whether it's not necessarily an election every 3 years kind of model right now, but they are interested in those progressions and they recognise that will have to happen. So approachable, friendly nations like Australia are really good places where they can learn that. They're also very, very interested in benchmarking some of the smart things that we've done as a country, i.e. our superannuation system or our health system. We might bitch about these things occasionally, but actually they are world best practice. So I think there's a whole hell of a lot. There's a good list that you can make of things that make us interesting and attractive to the Chinese, apart from iron ore. India. The Chinese aren't terribly interested in India. The whole Chindia thing is actually an Indian construct, I mean, I can just take it from my experience with BHP Billiton. BHP Billiton's business with China is 5 times larger than the business with India and growing faster, and that more or less characterises the amount of attention you should pay. No doubt India's moving along and is going to, I think, do some interesting things, but I always personally wonder what is going to be the point at which India somehow gets to a takeoff. China, you can sort of track back into the conversation that Michael and I were having, is you can sort of track back into the ascent of Deng, the death of Mao, those kind of things as cathartic moments where China made choices and did stuff. And then the model that China has, the ethnic homogeneity, things like that, give China distinctive advantages in terms of moving a developmental model along. India has a bunch of other stuff. Where's the Deng Xiaoping kind of thing? How are you going to pull it together? Now, I'm not suggesting that it might not happen, that the Indian model might not be extremely different to the Chinese model and do get into a takeoff mode of some description. But that's the sort of thing I look at when I think about how's India going to happen. Good growth, strong, lots of good stuff going to happen, but at a different order of magnitude than China.
Trevor Rowe. Look, I was in China recently again, and your point about Australians, I think, is very valid because they tend to be inquisitive. I'd suggest a bit more open with us. I'd been a few times, so I knew a few of the SEO chairmen and a few of the various bureaucrats I was meeting with in Shanghai and Beijing. But what struck me this time around, how more assertive the officials were in expressing views about the international environment, particularly the US, and the issues that concern them, i.e., did I think there was still a store of value in the US dollar? What did I think of some of Obama's views, and how do I as an Australian see that, and the like? And they got into issues about arms sales to Taiwan and climate change and all that sort of stuff. But on the other hand, I raised Google and the events there, which sort of always sort of got an interesting reaction in the sense they became somewhat paranoid and anxious about, well, they said, we know you're up here representing this wonderful university from Australia, Bond University as well, and, all that education and some of those exposures they've had might well influence how they think, and there was a degree of paranoia. So I came away with a sense that they're much more confident in articulating a view in terms of the international order and saw themselves as an equal to the US, in my view. And it was kind of interesting that they, as a developing country, saw it more of a G2 than the G20. That's my sense, my words. And then when I met with alumni of Bond University, and I kind of questioned them of what was happening with the movie Confucius and taking Avatar off, and I got a resounding, we had views here and we blogged the hell out of the government, and you'll notice they backed off. And I wonder what you think about that interplay and that sort of those relationships.
Yeah. I don't think the Chinese have ever seen themselves as the equal of the United States. I think they've always felt superior. I think the Chinese feel like they just had a couple of 100 years bad luck and they're coming back. There is, it's a power. I'm being a bit glib, but there's a powerful aspect to the worldview chauvinism that is there that has never really accepted anything except China exists at the pinnacle of global civilization. And that it's important to sort of have a perspective on that worldview that what you call the confidence is coming back, and some of it's a bit hubristic right at the moment. Some of it's, there's some famous reports of Wang Qishan in Brussels meeting a whole bunch of very senior people from big European corporations and being pretty abrupt with them. And it comes back to what I was just talking about, is they're winding back the welcome mat in terms of foreign investment. Don't need you anymore. We've got all the money we want. You need to borrow money from us. We've got all the technology we want. And if we haven't got it, we can buy it off you, or we can invest a lot in R&D and develop it ourselves. So actually, we don't need you anymore. And frankly, our priorities are domestic priorities. We've got 1.1 billion people yet to make rich. That's what matters. That's the only priority. All politics is domestic, and that's the only thing that matters. This stuff we have to deal with, bloody Copenhagen and you guys nagging us about renminbi, that's a sideline irritation. It really is quite irritating. I was saying to Michael or something that when the Politburo sits down for lunch to have a chat about things and they look at their agenda, the top 10 items are all domestic. Okay? And the Politburo only includes a couple of the vice premiers, right? And the foreign minister reports to a vice premier. Okay? Put foreign affairs in that context. I have a bit of a personal sort of intellectual construct of the extent to which the Western world, we have a few conceits about our relative importance to the Chinese. And we think now that they've got the whip hand, we've got to actually understand their worldview. They've had to put up with a lot of stuff when they were kind of on the rise, but post-GFC particularly, with 2.4 trillion forex in the bank and total capital adequacy, and a whole lot of other stuff going their way, we're going to see the manifestation of that worldview in different. Initially, it will be a little. You will have some encounters where people are perhaps not as sophisticated as they need to be. They'll be hubristic or perhaps crude in expressing it. I think you will see that become more sophisticated. A confident nation is actually a good thing to have. If you've got, if there's an elephant in the garden, you want a confident, domesticated elephant in the garden. You don't want an insecure, unhappy one. Right? So confidence is a really good thing and it should be encouraged. But I think encouraging that confidence is going to be a case of, and I allude to this, the Western world construct of talking to China is one of nagging them and criticising them, and has been that way for a long time. Now, they don't have to put up with that shit anymore. So you see this, Wen Jiabao, who's one of the sweetest, nicest, most placid people, and the Europeans lobbed up in Nanjing last year and nagged him all weekend about the renminbi. And Wen Jiabao, of all people, stood up on his hind legs and spat at him. Never seen that before. It's a real indicator of just, piss off, this doesn't matter. And we're not going to move the renminbi because you said so. We'll move it because it supports domestic developmental priorities. I hope that addresses you.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'd like to thank the Australia-China Council for their patience and their generosity, and same for you for your time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.